This is Karl Moore talking management for the Globe Mail. Today I'm delighted to speak to Ed Lawler, who's a senior professor at the Marshall School, University of Southern California. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Karl.
Ed, you're one of the, studied leadership for a long time, one of the top people in the world. What is due about leadership this year?
Chris Worley and I emphasize this very strongly in our recent book called Management Reset, that we're looking more at what you call distributed leadership or shared leadership, but how you develop a company of leaders more than a hero leader. We've certainly gone through and continue to have a bit of a worship relationship with people who are super successful and lead large companies and so forth and so on, and they're obviously add a lot of value, but they don't really lead throughout the organization on a day-to-day basis. And what we see, at least, is more and more companies recognizing that and saying, hey, we have to look at our organization from a developing leadership point of view, which argues that leaders are throughout the company. They may not be leaders today, but when a situation comes up that requires leadership, we need people who are capable of stepping up and saying, okay, I'll take that one on, or I'll head that group, or I'll take this initiative, and so forth and so on. So that kind of broadly based leadership capability, which we call shared leadership, I think is probably the newest thing, and that requires selecting people throughout the organization for their potential to be leaders, seeing leadership training as something that permeates the organization, and of course a willingness on the part of the organization to allow people who don't have a job title of manager or executive or whatever to take on leadership roles, whether it be in task forces or teams or just on a customer issue that comes up, to encourage people and reward them for taking a leadership role in solving a problem or creating a new program.
This kind of a new approach, it requires senior leaders to be a bit more humble and spend more time listening than talking. Are people starting to do that, do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't disagree with you that it does take a different kind of senior leadership to share leadership, if you will, or distribute leadership. And I see more of it, but certainly it's not universal. I mean, a lot of people get to be CEOs and want to be CEOs because they want to be the ultimate leader and the clear driver of the organization, and that's what their ego is all about. But I do see more of a new generation of leaders who understand that, yes, they can set a climate, they can set a culture, but they need help throughout the organization in order to have a well-led organization.
You've been looking at gathering data from around the world. Is this approach to more distributed leadership, is it more of a North American, European thing, but not as true as, say, India and China and Russia? Or do you see it as something that's spreading around the whole global economy?
It's a good question. I see it spreading, certainly in European countries. I'm not so sure about certainly places like Russia or China. One of the pieces on China was when we collected data on it for my HR program and see what their HR functions look like. And they are sort of where the rest of the world was 20 or 30 years ago. When we looked at Europe, US, very similar. We did ask there about management styles in our HR survey in the company. And again, China looked very different than even India in terms of a more traditional bureaucratic top-down management approach. And that was in their private enterprises, not in their government enterprises.
Ed, you and a co-author for a number of years now have put out a regular book on HR around the world and where it is today. What's the latest thinking about HR in today's world?
Probably the biggest gap in the world of HR is between what HR aspires to be and what it actually is in corporations today on a global basis. HR continues to talk about being a strategic player, a innovative, involved business partner, but our data, which we've been collecting now for over 15 years, across the globe tends to suggest that it still is stuck a bit in a transactional mode and in a bureaucratic mode that often prevents it from being at the table and having an influential role in key business decisions, even though we're in a world in which everybody says human capital is the most important asset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So HR has not, I think, done a good job of becoming a innovative partner in business development and business strategy.
You know, I've heard, Ed, we've heard this from you, we've heard it from people like David Ulrich for years. What can HR do to get out of the mud and get real traction becoming at the table with the other executives?
It starts with two things, I think: talent and organization design and organization structure. HR has not got a history of recruiting the best and the brightest. You and I both teach in business schools. all too often the highest salaries, the prime jobs are not HR jobs. So that has to change. HR, which actually controls the employment in companies, has to begin to say, we're not the poor stepchild when it comes to talent. We are a leading absorber and utilizer of MBA talent, and people in HR are as talented and as highly paid as people elsewhere in the organization. Because typically they haven't been. And if you're coming out of your MBA program with $80,000 worth of debt, you're looking for some income, chances are, and therefore you're not looking at HR, at least in the States, because it's not as high paying. But I think it's more fundamental in some ways than talent. Talent's a key issue. The other is the way the job is structured and the way the function is structured. I've sort of given up, if you will, on traditional HR ever converting to something that's more strategic and more organization design and effectiveness oriented. I think perhaps those two things just don't go together. The skills that it takes to run the bureaucratic administrative side of HR are different. The people who go into it seem to be different. And it has a kind of demand character and sort of day-to-day crisis. How do I get out of this? What do I do about this government regulation? How do I pay this person who's got a job offer from somewhere else? That it absorbs, even at the very top level, the time, energy, and intelligence of some very good people who are in those positions. And they will say, oh yeah, gee, I'm really concerned about strategy and we ought to move here, but for the moment I got to put this fire out. So I think really I've been writing recently that we have to perhaps split the job and realize there is an administrative crisis transactional piece that's separate, and that should have its own head and its own, and then there's something else, call it organizational effectiveness or whatever, and that should have things like business strategy, organization design, organizational change management is its major agenda items, and that should report into the very top level. That's the other piece of it, of course. In many organizations, the HR function doesn't report to the CEO. It's one level below that. And obviously it's hard to get to the table when you're not at the level that goes to the table.
Ed, you've been looking at leadership for many decades now, and you've seen generations come and go to some degree as leaders. You see the people under 30 that they want to be led differently than their parents were led?
A good question. A tricky one to answer because we've got obviously age effects as well as generational effects in there. And I'm always impressed when you look at people, regardless of age, of the individual differences and the tremendous diversity based on country, gender, age, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I do think that the younger generation is a little more comfortable with the shared leadership model and the distributed power model. You know, the technology, the internet, social networking, et cetera, I think has led to different comfort level with different communication patterns, different ways of relating to people. So they, I think, are perhaps more comfortable in a situation where people talk and share and decide what they're going to do rather than some top-down universal power figure coming in and saying, okay, you 5 people run over there and you 5 people run over there and we'll do it that way. So it does fit more of their interactive pattern, if you will, that they've been comfortable with for quite a few years now.
You mentioned that there's an age effect. Do you see that, and you've watched some generations now, do you see that people that they're 25, they're certain, you know, a bit more, let's push the system, but when they hit 40, they kind of buy into the system? Is that something you've seen for a few decades now?
Yeah, I think it's always been true that people are not the same at 50 or 40 as they were at 25. You go back and look at the data that was collected, for example, during the Vietnam period in the United States and what kids said they wanted from job and from their life and so forth and so on, and you look at what that same age group says now, and it's totally different. You know, they've become, unfortunately or fortunately, much more sort of products of the system and saying, yeah, I want a family and so forth and so on. And when they were 20-something, they wanted to make a difference in the world and change the world and so forth and so on. Now they want a secure future and a job, basically. Yeah. And combination, of course, of aging and the economic factors that they face. People change, they do, no question about it.